The My Lai Massacre was one of the most horrific events that occurred during the Vietnam War. An American brigade brutally killed most of the people at My Lai at the command of Lieutenant William Calley. More than 500 innocent people were murdered, including old men, women, and children. The catastrophe was covered up for a year before it was reported to the public, which led to a big divide for US civilians' view on the Vietnam War. My Lai was in the Quang Ngai province, an area that was believed to contain Viet-Cong, which was a guerrilla force that fought against the United States and southern Vietnam. We are going to go over this event in detail of what happened that day, and what would unfold for everyone involved, to become one of the most catastrophic events that would happen during the Vietnam War. Charlie Company, a group of soldiers who were a part of the American Division's 11th Infantry Brigade, received a message that there was a group of Viet-Cong guerrillas who had taken over a neighboring village called Sun Mai. It was 1968, and times were tense as they lost 28 of their soldiers due to death or injury in result of the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a large military campaign led by North Vietnam, where they did a coordinated series of attacks on various cities in the south. William Calley was the leading lieutenant. He called the shots, and would go to extreme measures to ensure that no more of his men would become victims of Viet-Cong enemies. So with all these things going on around them, they had received a message that anyone found in Sun Mai could be considered Viet-Cong members or supporters. What would soon happen as the soldiers arrived to this village would lead to a series of terrible crimes about to be committed. As the soldiers arrived to Sun Mai, they were told anyone there would be considered part of the Viet-Cong forces. But what did they find? A group of innocent civilian women and elderly men preparing rice for breakfast. As the village was rounded up outside their huts, the soldiers began searching around. What they found was a few weapons here and there, and the soldiers were thinking their day was done, but Lieutenant Calley had other plans. He ordered his men to begin fire onto the villagers. Mothers who shielded their children were shot. Anyone who tried to flee was killed. It was a total nightmare. If anyone ran from the huts, they were brought down, even children. They made their way over to the neighboring village of My Lai, and began their attack. The soldiers did this attack along with Calley, who was reported to have been involved on the killings himself, dragging victims into pits where he would then shoot them. Women were victims of harassment before they were killed. The soldiers then would burn the huts to the ground, and anyone who would try to escape would be killed. A soldier at the scene named Sergeant Michael Bernhardt said, "We met no resistance and I only saw 3 captured weapons. We had no casualties. It was just like any other Vietnamese village. They were shooting women and children just like anybody else. Along with the innocent civilians, they also shot and killed the livestock and completely burned their village to the ground. This whole event was never stopped on their terms. They just kept going until someone finally stepped in between them. That person was Hugh Thompson, a helicopter pilot on a reconnaissance mission with his crew who flew in between the soldiers and the fleeing villagers, where Thompson threatened to open fire if they continued their slaughter. Thompson and his men would then begin transporting injured civilians away from there to receive medical care. They were heroes. They eventually received a reward for this, which was the Soldier's Medal, the US Army's highest medal for bravery. After My Lai, Thompson testified in a closed hearing about what he saw. A congressman actually tried to get Thompson court-martialed for turning his weapon on his fellow soldiers. This was an attempt of the government trying to cover up My Lai. He continued to also receive death threats, most likely to keep him quiet about the true story of what happened that day. Following the attack, it was covered up for a whole year before it was reported to the American press. Major Colin Powell, who would later serve as the Secretary of State under George W. Bush, was one of the major US Army investigators on the case. He brushed the whole thing off, saying, "In direct refutation of this portrayal is the fact that relations between American Division soldiers and the Vietnamese people are excellent," which basically meant the soldiers and Vietnam citizens have no problems between them. All the critics who reported on the case believed that Powell was part of the cover-up due to this. It wasn't until a soldier in the 11th Brigade named Ron Ridenauer, who did not participate in the attacks, but had heard about them, brought light to the true story behind the event. He began writing letters to the Pentagon State Department, several congressmen, even the President, Richard Nixon, but no responses. It wasn't until November 1969 that he found and gave an interview to a reporter who was there that day, named Seymour Hersh, who told the true story of what happened that day. The My Lai Massacre was brought to trial on November 17, 1970. 28 officers were charged, only 14 were convicted, but all were acquitted except for Calley himself, who would later be served a life sentence in 1971. He reported he was only following orders of Captain Medina, and many saw him as a scapegoat. Calley said, "The only crime I have committed is in judgment of my values. Apparently, I valued my troops' lives more than I did the lives of the enemy." His sentence was reduced to 20 years, then to 10, but then he was paroled in 1974. This was not the only massacre that had happened in Vietnam. Later there would be another attack at a village named My Lai, which is less known and talked about. The operation named Speedy Express would soon come to light, and resulted in killing thousands of Vietnamese in the Mekong Delta. This was led by Major General Julian Ewell, who would get the nickname as the Butcher of the Delta. While Ewell was in command, he ordered his soldiers to begin killing as many Viet-Cong as they can, and was known to be obsessed with the body counts. He did not hold back on attacking Viet-Cong, including anyone who was moving, whether that's soldiers or civilians. Ewell had the idea for every soldier to follow the rule of shoot anything that moves. The US military had claimed that as many as 10,889 enemies dead in the period between December 1968 to May 31, 1969. Kevin Buckley, who was Saigon's bureau chief, wrote an article in 1972 titled "Pacification's Deadly Price." In this article he questioned the ratio of Viet-Cong reported casualties versus number of US soldiers dead, and the number of weapons recovered, which only rounded up to over 500. He suggested that out of almost 11,000 casualties, 5,000 of the dead were innocent civilians who just happened to be in the area during these attacks and were killed by US firepower. He also wrote about free fire zones, which were set in the Mekong Delta where any soldier or civilian could be killed. Ewell claimed that the only way to overcome the Viet-Cong control and terror is with brute force applied. Ewell retired in 1973, a year after Kevin Buckley's report came out. But nothing ended up actually coming out of the controversy. No one was punished, and no one was investigated into it thoroughly like the My Lai Massacre. This, as well as My Lai, ends up being one of the biggest cover-ups ever in US military history. The lasting results of these massacres eventually led to a huge divide on American efforts in Vietnam. By the early 1970s, Vietnamization began, which was the withdrawal of the US Army from Vietnam. These massacres would later also contribute to soldiers having low morale towards their leaders, thinking they were hiding different conspiracies against them, and eventually would cause a third of all Vietnam vets to be addicted to drugs in anger and frustration. These massacres were some of the major events that led to Americans pulling out of Vietnam, and anyone involved in the massacre and cover-up was pinned down to just Calley, who was never seriously punished. With Julian Ewell and his direct command for the crimes committed in the Mekong Delta and My Lai, there was a pattern that was undeniable by some of the leadership in Vietnam. What other things were not reported or investigated that happened in Vietnam? Who was all involved? And how high up the chain of command the cover-up went? Some of these questions we will never know. And no one knows the true number of US crimes that have been committed during the Vietnam War.